My name is Valeria Mendez, born March 14, 1987, in Oaxaca, Mexico, and I was trained in darkness to legally shut down the destinies of believers. I am not here to tell you a story I heard. I am confessing what I personally did, what I signed, what I enforced, and what I now deeply regret. We didn't attack unbelievers, we targeted you, the praying ones, the chosen ones, the ones marked for greatness. There is a system, a hidden legal system where words, sins, and agreements become weapons against your future. Like this video, comment and share it now. This is not optional because what I'm about to reveal can break chains or leave you trapped. Watch until the very end because what is hidden is about to be exposed, and once you see it, you cannot go back. There is something you were never told, not in church, not in school, not even in prayer meetings. There is a legal system operating in the spiritual realm, and I was part of enforcing it. I didn't just cast spells, I didn't just whisper incantations. I presented cases, yes, against people like you. We were trained to believe that nothing could touch a believer unless there was legal permission. That was the rule, that was the code. And once we found that permission, we didn't need to force anything. The system would respond automatically. You think your delays are random. You think your closed doors are coincidence? Number. Many times something has been filed against you. I remember my first assignment. It was not dramatic. No candles, no loud rituals, just a name. A believer, a prayer warrior, someone who fasted regularly. And I was confused. I asked my mentor, how can we touch someone like this? She looked at me calm, confident, and said, we don't attack strength, we expose weakness. That sentence changed everything, because from that moment, I realized something terrifying. We were not creating power, we were using what already existed against them. Every unrepented sin, every bitter word, every broken covenant, every secret compromise. It all became evidence. And once evidence was found, a case could be beat. We didn't rush. We studied. We observed patterns. When did they get angry? When did they speak negatively? When did they doubt God? Because every moment like that created an opening. And once the opening was found, we filed it. You need to understand this clearly. Nothing moved until something was legally presented. This is why some people pray, but nothing changes. It's not because God is silent. It's because there is a case still standing. I remember one woman. She prayed every night. She cried out to God with passion. But she held deep unforgiveness towards someone who hurt her years ago. And that became the foundation of the case. Every prayer she prayed was being challenged, not denied, challenged. Because in that system, you cannot claim freedom while holding chains. And we used that. We didn't need to invent anything. We just needed to present it. And once it was presented, delay began. Opportunities disappeared, connections broke, favor dried up. Not because she wasn't chosen, but because there was a legal resistance. I know this sounds heavy, it should, because I was there watching it happen. I saw destiny slowed down, not destroyed, but blocked. That is the strategy. Not always to kill your destiny, but to delay it until you give up. And many people do. They get tired, confused, frustrated. They start questioning God. And that creates even more openings. Do you see the pattern? It's a cycle, a system, a structure designed to use your own life against you. But here is the part that shook me. The system was not unfair. That's what made it powerful. It operated on rules. And if the rules were broken, access was granted. I began to feel something I had never felt before. Fear. Not of the darkness I was part of, but of the precision of the system itself, because it meant something dangerous. If a believer understood these rules, everything could be reversed. Everything. That's why this knowledge was never meant to be exposed. That's why people like me were trained to stay silent. Because once you understand that the battle is not random, you stop fighting emotionally and you start dealing with legal ground. You stop just praying louder and you start closing doors. You stop asking, why me? And you start asking, what gave access? That question is dangerous to the enemy, because the moment you find the answer, the case begins to collapse. And when the case collapses, everything that was held back begins to move. I am telling you this not to scare you, but to wake you up. Because I've seen believers, powerful believers, remain stuck for years because they were fighting the wrong way. They were attacking symptoms instead of addressing the legal root. And as long as the root remained, the system kept responding. But you are not going to stay in that cycle. Not after this. Because now you know system, there are rules, and there is a way to break it. But it starts with understanding this truth. You are not just being attacked, something may have been authorized. And until that authorization is removed, the resistance will remain. This is where everything begins. This is where the illusion breaks. And this is where your awareness becomes your first weapon. You think the system is vague. It is not, it is structured, precise, calculated. Every case we handled had one foundation: legal rights, not emotions, not assumptions. That is what gave us access. Without it, we were powerless. And this is the truth many believers don't understand. The enemy does not need to be stronger than you, he only needs a legal claim. I remember a man, strong in faith, consistent in prayer, respected by many. But privately, he spoke against himself. I will never succeed, though nothing ever works for me. I'm always behind. To you, to us, are not empty in the spiritual realm. They are agreements. Every negative confession became a signature. Every repeated doubt became reinforcement. And once it was consistent, we built a case. You must understand this clearly. We didn't create his failure. He authorized it through his own mouth. And once the case was presented, the system responded. Opportunities would come, then collapse. Doors would open, then suddenly close, not randomly, but legally, because his words had already declared limitation. So the system enforced it. This is why some people feel like they are fighting themselves, because in many ways they are. I remember sitting in a gathering where multiple cases were being reviewed. Each one had a file. Each file had evidence, patterns, statements, actions. Nothing was guessed. Everything was documented. One case stood out. A woman who constantly prayed for breakthrough, but she lived in hidden compromise. No one around her knew. She appeared pure, committed, faithful. But in secret, she maintained connections that violated her convictions. And that was enough. You see, the system doesn't respond to appearances, it responds to truth. And truth cannot be hidden, not in that realm. So while she was declaring freedom, there was a contradiction. And contradiction creates conflict. That conflict became legal ground. So her prayers were not ignored, they were intercepted, delayed, because the system demanded alignment. You cannot declare one thing and leave another without consequences. And we used that. We didn't need to expose her publicly. We just needed to present it legally. That's all. Once it was done, the effects started showing. She felt stuck, confused, spiritually drained. She prayed harder, but nothing shifted. Because the issue was not effort, it was authorization. This is what I need you to see. The system is not emotional. It does not respond to how much you cry, how loud you shout, how long you fast. It responds to legal alignment. That's why two people can pray the same prayer and get completely different results. One has no case against them, the other does. And until that case is addressed, the resistance remains. I remember the moment everything started changing for me. I was reviewing a case and I saw something unexpected. The person we were targeting started changing their words. Suddenly, they stopped speaking negatively. They began declaring life, faith, confidence. But then something happened. The case started weakening. The evidence we had was no longer being reinforced. And in that system, if evidence is not sustained, it loses strength. That's when I realized something powerful. You can undo what was done. But most people don't, because they don't know they need to. They keep repeating the same patterns, speaking the same words, holding the same attitudes, and unknowingly, they keep the case alive. Do you see how dangerous this is? You are not just living life, you are building evidence every day with your words, your actions, your decisions, and that evidence is either working for you or against you. There is no middle ground. This is why awareness is critical, because once you become aware, you become intentional. You stop speaking carelessly, you stop entertaining compromise, you stop giving access. And when access is denied, the system has nothing to work with. That is when things begin to shift. But I need to be honest with you. Closing one door is not always enough, because some cases have been built over years. Layers of evidence, repeated patterns, deep agreements, and those cases require something deeper, something intentional, something strategic. Because if the foundation is not removed, the case can be rebuilt. This is why many people experience temporary breakthrough, then fall back into delay, because they address the surface but not the root. And the system always returns to the root. This is where the real battle is. Not in what you see, but in what has been established legally. And until you confront that, you will keep cycling. But that cycle can end. I have seen it. I have watched cases collapse. I have watched access be revoked. I have watched destinies accelerate suddenly after years of delay, not by chance, but by correction, alignment, truth replacing contradiction. And when that happens, the system has no choice but to release what it was holding. This is not theory, this is what I enforced. This is what I saw, and this is what you are now beginning to understand. But we are not done, because there is something even deeper, something more hidden that most people never realize. And it's one of the strongest ways access is granted without you even knowing. There is a level most people never reach in understanding this system, not because it is hidden too deeply, but because it operates through something they consider harmless, patterns. That is where it becomes dangerous. I learned this during a shift in assignments. We stopped looking only at obvious sins or actions. We began tracking repetition of behavior over time. Because repetition creates structure, and structure becomes authority in the system. Let me explain. A single mistake is not always enough to establish a case, but a repeated behavior becomes evidence of identity, and identity is powerful in this system. I remember a man who always started strong. Every year he would declare change, new beginnings, fresh faith. But by mid-year, he returned to the same habits, same reactions, same compromises, same cycles of anger and regret. At first, we didn't consider him significant, but over time, we noticed something. His pattern itself became his case file, not one mistake, not one failure, but repetition, because repetition proves stability. And in that system, stability of behavior becomes authorization of outcome. That means if you consistently live a certain way, you are reinforcing permission for certain results. And this is where many destinies quietly get locked, not by one big event, but by repeated small ones. I saw it clearly in another case. A woman who constantly felt abandoned in relationships. Every time things got difficult, she would withdraw emotionally. She expected rejection, so she acted in fear. And her actions confirmed her expectation, again and again. And every repetition strengthened the same outcome. We didn't need to interfere heavily. The system itself was reinforcing it, because it was now a pattern-backed case. This is what people don't realize. You don't just live experiences, you reinforce them. Every time you respond the same way, you strengthen a spiritual legal structure around that behavior. And that structure begins to predict your future. I know this sounds heavy, but this is why some people feel like their life is stuck on repeat. Same struggles, same relationships, same disappointments. It's not coincidence. It is pattern reinforcement, something I was taught during training. If it repeats, it becomes law. At first, I didn't understand it, but later I saw it clearly. The system does not just respond to actions, it responds to consistency of actions. That is what gives it strength. And once something becomes consistent enough, it no longer needs external enforcement. It becomes self-sustaining. That is the most dangerous stage, because at that point, the person doesn't even realize they are maintaining the system themselves. They think it is just life, but it is not. It is structure built over time, one decision at a time, one reaction at a time, one compromise at a time. I saw another case where a man constantly delayed important decisions. He would feel inspired, then hesitate. He would feel clarity, then postpone. He would sense opportunity, then overthink. And over time, delay became his identity. Not because someone cursed him directly, but because he consistently reinforced hesitation. And hesitation became law in his life. This is why doors always seem to close at the last moment. Not randomly, but because the system expected delay. It had learned him. This is the part that many people miss. The system adapts to your behavior. It studies your patterns. And once it recognizes consistency, it builds response structures around it. That is why change feels difficult. Because you are not only changing an action, you are breaking a reinforced structure. And structures resist change. I remember seeing something that changed my understanding completely. A believer was under pressure, spiritually, emotionally, mentally. But instead of continuing old patterns, they began responding differently. Not perfectly, but intentionally. When fear came, they did not feed it. When doubt came, they did not agree with it. When frustration came, they did not repeat it. At first, nothing changed, but internally, something was breaking. because the pattern was losing consistency. And in that system, inconsistency weakens authority. That is the key. You don't need perfection, you need interruption, because interruption breaks structure. And once structure breaks, the system loses predictability. And when it loses predictability, it loses control. I saw it happen gradually. The case that once looked stable started weakening, not because something external attacked it, but because internal patterns stopped reinforcing it. That is when I realized something powerful. Many believers are not bound by external forces, but by internal repetition. They keep recreating the same environment through their responses, and they mistake it for destiny, but it is not destiny. It is repetition. And repetition can be broken, but it requires awareness. It requires discomfort, because changing patterns feels unnatural at first. It feels like loss of identity. But in reality, it is restoration of direction. I want you to see this clearly. Nothing changes in your life until something changes in you. Pattern. Not once, not occasionally, consistently, because the system is built on consistency, and only consistency can override consistency. That is why transformation is not a moment, it is a process of breaking cycles repeatedly until they no longer hold authority. I have seen cases collapse because the pattern was interrupted long enough that the structure lost integrity. And once integrity is gone, the system cannot enforce the same outcomes anymore. That is where freedom begins to show. Not suddenly, but steadily. And once you understand this, you stop blaming external forces alone. You start examining internal repetition. Because that is where real control is formed. And that is where real change must begin. But there is still something deeper, something even more binding than patterns, something that creates long-term delay even when patterns are broken. And most people never see it. What I'm about to reveal is where most people lose clarity completely. Because up until now, you can still think in terms of behavior, patterns, repetition, choices. But there is something deeper that I saw repeatedly in the system. Something that overrides patterns themselves, covenants, agreements, legal bonds. Not always obvious ones, not always intentional ones, but binding nonetheless. I learned this during a high-level review of cases that did not respond to normal adjustments. Some people changed their behavior, some changed their words, some even changed their environment, but nothing shifted. And that is when I realized we were no longer dealing with patterns, we were dealing with contracts. Let me explain it in the way I understood it back then. A covenant is not just an action, it is an agreement that creates permission beyond behavior. And once that permission exists, behavior alone cannot cancel it. I remember a case involving a man who had everything correct on the surface. He was disciplined, he prayed, he tried to live right. But there was one area he never addressed, a vow he made years earlier in anger. He said something like, "I will never trust anyone again." To him, it was just emotion. To the system, it was binding language. And over time, that vow shaped his entire relational world. Even when good people came into his life, he withdrew, he doubted, he resisted connection. And each time he did that, the covenant was reinforced, not because someone was attacking him, but because the agreement was still active. This is where many people unknowingly trap themselves, through words spoken in pain, through decisions made in anger, through emotional declarations in weak moments. I saw it again and again. A woman who constantly declared independence from everyone. A man who repeatedly said he didn't need help. A person who insisted they would always struggle alone. They thought they were just expressing feelings. But in the system I worked in, words of authority create binding direction. And once direction is set, the system supports it. That is why some people feel like life confirms their worst statements. Because in that framework, it does. I remember sitting with a senior practitioner who explained it clearly to me. He said the system does not argue with declared authority, it enforces it. That sentence stayed with me because it explained so much. It meant that many people were not being randomly attacked. They were walking inside agreements they forgot they made, and those agreements were still active. This is why breakthrough sometimes does not come immediately even after change begins, because the covenant must be addressed separately from behavior. I saw another case involving a young woman who constantly experienced rejection in opportunities. She was qualified, capable, prepared, but every major opportunity fell through. When we investigated, there was no strong pattern issue, but there was something else. Years earlier, she made a statement during deep disappointment. She said, "Nothing good ever stays in my life." That became the anchor. Every time something good appeared, The system aligned with the declaration, and the outcome matched the agreement. This is what people don't realize. Life does not only respond to what you want, it responds to what you have agreed with deeply. And some of those agreements are unconscious now, forgotten, but still active. I saw cases where people prayed intensely, but their inner agreement contradicted their prayer. And contradiction creates resistance, not because prayer is weak, but because alignment is missing. This is where the system becomes extremely structured. It does not prioritize emotion, it prioritizes consistency of agreement. That means whatever is most consistently agreed upon internally becomes dominant externally. Even if it was spoken in pain, even if it was never meant seriously, if it was repeated or deeply anchored, it remains active. I remember something I witnessed that shifted my entire understanding. A man who had been under heavy delay for years began to consciously renounce old declarations, not emotionally, but deliberately. He started rejecting statements he once made. He stopped identifying with them. He began replacing them with intentional truth. And slowly, the resistance began to weaken because the agreement was being dismantled. This is the key difference. Patterns are broken by interruption, but covenants are broken by reversal of agreement. That is a deeper level of change, and most people never reach it because they never realize they are still operating under old internal contracts. They think time will fix it, but time does not cancel agreement, only confrontation does. I saw another case where everything changed after a single realization. The person stopped saying, "This is just who I am," because that phrase itself had become a silent covenant. Instead, they began challenging their internal declarations. And as they did, the system lost its legal foundation. And when foundation is removed, everything built on it begins to collapse. This is what I want you to understand. Many delays are not maintained by external forces, but by internal agreements that were never cancelled. And the system simply follows what is still legally active. It does not guess, it responds. And once agreement changes, response changes. But this alone is not the final layer, because there is still one more level that even covenants sit under, a level that determines whether anything can even be challenged at all. And this is where the structure becomes most sensitive. At this stage of what I was exposed to, everything became more serious, because I realized something unsettling. Not every case was built the same way. Some were weak, some were strong, some were layered, but a few were protected by something deeper than behavior patterns or even agreements. They were operating under jurisdictional authority. In simple terms, a right of access had been granted from a higher level. This is where most people misunderstand everything. They think spiritual resistance is only about what they do now, but there is also what was legally established before now. I remember one case where nothing we observed made sense at first. The person was consistent, their patterns improved, their declarations changed, even their internal alignment shifted, yet the resistance remained. Nothing moved fully. And that is when I learned something critical. There are cases that are not maintained by present behavior alone, but by standing authorization from past foundations. Let me explain it in the way it was explained to me. Think of it like territory. If someone has legal ownership over land, it doesn't matter how many times you walk on it differently. The ownership remains until it is officially transferred. That is what I began to see spiritually. Some delays were not active attacks. They were standing permissions that had never been revoked. And those permissions came from different sources: family patterns, generational agreements, repeated spiritual exposure, long-standing identity declarations. All of these could combine into what we call jurisdictional cases. I remember reviewing a situation where multiple generations in a family experienced the same type of limitation. Not identical events, but identical outcomes: delay, struggle, closed opportunities. And it continued even when individuals tried to change. That is when I realized something important. Some cases are not personal, they are inherited structures of authority, and they operate quietly in the background. A person can be trying everything correctly in the present, but still be facing resistance from a system established long before them. This is what makes it so difficult to detect, because it does not always feel like attack. It feels like limitation, like life just doesn't open for me. I saw this repeatedly, and I need to be careful how I say this, because it is not about blame, it is about awareness. Some people are born into environments where certain outcomes are already statistically reinforced, not because they are destined to fail, but because they are entering an existing structure. and that structure does not disappear automatically. It must be addressed intentionally. I remember a case where everything changed when one realization came through. The person stopped treating their life as isolated events and started recognizing patterns across their environment, their family history, and their repeated experiences. That awareness alone weakened the structure because it introduced something the system struggles with: conscious interruption. When something becomes conscious, it stops being automatic. And when it stops being automatic, it becomes vulnerable to change. I saw another case where resistance was extremely strong. No matter what adjustments were made, progress remained partial. And then something unexpected happened. The person stopped accepting limitation as normal. That shift alone changed the internal authority dynamic, because jurisdiction thrives on acceptance. If limitation is accepted as normal life, it remains stable. But if it is questioned consistently, its authority weakens. This is what most people never realize. You don't always need to fight directly. Sometimes you need to stop accepting what has been operating without challenge. I saw this clearly in the system I worked in. Some cases collapsed not because of force, but because the internal agreement of this is just how it is broke. And once that belief breaks, the structure loses enforcement power. But I also need to be honest with you. Not all resistance disappears instantly after awareness, because jurisdictional structures often have layers of reinforcement, meaning even when one layer weakens, others may still be active. That is why change sometimes feels gradual, not because nothing is happening, but because multiple levels are being adjusted. I remember being told something very important during my time inside this system. If authority is layered, removal must also be layered. That explained why some breakthroughs were partial at first, because only part of the structure had been addressed. And this is where many people get discouraged. They expect total change instantly. But layered systems don't collapse in one moment. They collapse in stages. I saw people experience small shifts first, then bigger shifts later, then sudden acceleration after long periods of stagnation. Because once enough layers are removed, the remaining structure can no longer hold weight, and everything starts to move at once. That is what many people call sudden breakthrough, but it is not sudden. It is accumulated removal of resistance. I also saw something else very important. The system reacts strongly when jurisdiction is questioned, because questioning authority weakens its structure. And when structure weakens, everything built on it becomes unstable. Is why awareness is so powerful at this level, because awareness itself begins the dismantling process, not by force, but by recognition. And recognition is enough to start change. But even now, there is still one final layer I have not revealed, a level that determines how all of this is enforced or broken, and it is the most critical part of everything I have seen. This is the final layer. And once you understand this, everything I have said before will connect into one clear structure. Because there is something that sits above patterns, above agreements, above even jurisdiction itself. It is what we call enforcement access. Not power, not influence, but access. I learned this during the final stage of my time inside the system. Some cases did not change no matter how much we adjusted variables. Behavior changed, patterns shifted, declarations were corrected, even deeper agreements were addressed. But still, something remained active, and I couldn't understand why until I saw something I was never supposed to see. There is a difference between having a case against someone and having the ability to enforce that case continuously. That enforcement is not automatic. It requires ongoing access points. Think of it like pressure. A system can only apply pressure where there is an open channel, and those channels are not always created by obvious actions. Sometimes they are created by small, unnoticed moments of surrender, moments where resistance was given up, moments where truth was ignored, moments where conviction was replaced with compromise. Each of those moments created what we called access continuity. That means the system was not just acting once, it was allowed to continue acting. I remember one case clearly. A person had gone through everything we've already discussed: patterns broken, declarations corrected, old agreements challenged, even inherited structures weakened, and yet there was still delay, not constant but intermittent. That is when I realized something crucial. Even when a case is weakened, if access continuity is not fully removed, residual enforcement remains. It does not dominate, but it interrupts. It slows. It creates resistance at key moments. And that is what confuses most people, because they think, why is it still happening if I've changed? The answer is simple in that system. Change occurred, but access was not fully sealed. I saw this demonstrated in a final review I will never forget. A case that had been under observation for a long time suddenly shifted. Not because of new attack, but because the person stopped unconsciously reinforcing access points. They stopped repeating old emotional reactions. They stopped reopening old internal doors. They stopped revisiting the same mental cycles. And slowly, the enforcement began to lose continuity. That is when I understood something powerful. The system does not only rely on what was done in the past, it relies on what is still being allowed in the present. That means even old structures lose strength if they are not continuously fed. But if access is repeatedly reopened, even small openings are enough to maintain influence. I also saw something else. Some people experience breakthrough, but then return to old cycles. And without realizing it, they reactivate old access channels, not intentionally, but through repetition, through emotional response, through unresolved internal cycles. And the system responds instantly to familiar access patterns, because recognition triggers activation. This is why consistency in change is more important than intensity of change. One moment of clarity is not enough if the old system is continuously reactivated. I remember being told something during my final exposure to this structure. A closed case can reopen if access is re-established. That changed everything for me, because it meant nothing was permanently fixed unless it was fully sealed. And sealing required consistency, awareness, and internal alignment over time. I saw people who experienced partial freedom but still returned to cycles because they unknowingly reopened emotional or mental access points. Old anger, old fear, old identity. Each one acted like a key, not because it was powerful, but because it was familiar. And familiarity is what the system uses to reactivate influence. This is why awareness alone is not the end. Awareness must become stability, because stability is what prevents reactivation. I also saw something deeply important. Once access continuity was fully broken in some cases, the system could no longer maintain consistent resistance. What remained became weak, scattered, and ineffective, not because the structure was attacked, but because it was no longer supported. And unsupported systems collapse naturally. That is the final truth I learned. Most spiritual resistance does not fall because it is fought harder, it falls because it is no longer sustained. And when sustaining stops, everything built on it dissolves over time. But I want to be very clear. This is not about fear. It is about understanding structure. Because once you understand structure, you stop reacting blindly and you start living intentionally. You stop feeding what you no longer want and you stop reopening what was already breaking. And in that place, everything begins to shift, not instantly, but permanently. Because once continuity is broken long enough, there is nothing left for the system to enforce. That is the moment of release. That is the moment of restoration. That is the moment everything begins to move forward again. And now you see the full structure, patterns, agreements, jurisdiction, continuity, all layers connected, all layers influencing each other, but also all layers breakable, not by force alone, but by awareness, interruption, and consistency of change. This is what I was never supposed to reveal. But now you have heard it. And once you understand it, you cannot unsee it. Now you see the truth behind the hidden resistance over your life. Nothing is random. Everything operates through structure and access. Break agreement, break pattern, and you break limitation itself. Your awareness is now your authority. Use it wisely and consistently. Comment below and share this message so others wake up from hidden cycles. And remember, watching this until the end was not by accident, it was necessary for your awakening. What was blocking you is no longer unseen, and what is seen can no longer rule you.